We're getting really close to team number one in our prospect pool breakdowns. We're going through teams 5 through 3 today. We've got the San Jose Sharks, the Anaheim Ducks, and the Buffalo Sabres coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. During the summertime, though, it's going to be 3 times a week. I'm Hadi Kalikesh, joined by Sebastian and Hadi, and we're here to break down teams 5 through 3 of our prospect pool breakdowns. We've gone through the first teams from 32 up to 6, and now we've got 3 more to break down for you. We're getting really close to number 1. We've got the San Jose Sharks, we've got the Anaheim Ducks, and the Buffalo Sabres coming up on today's episode. Before we get into it, though, just want to let you know this episode is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Now go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNHL or enter promo code LockedOnNHL at the website for a free white tech hat. If you're watching on YouTube, it's the hat that Sebastian's got on his head right now. Very comfortable. Just a great hat overall. You can get that for free with any order if you put in that promo code. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. We can promise you that. All right. So before we get into the episode itself, I just want to remind you as well to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you want us to talk about. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. It is always very much appreciated. So we're going to get right into it with team number 5 in our prospect pool breakdown. We've got the San Jose Sharks. Now, the Sharks are an interesting one. They've got a lot of depth in some decent positions. What I really like, though, is the prospect quality up top. They just added Will Smith in the 2023 NHL draft with their first pick of the draft, and that was a decent pickup. We're both really good fans of Oliver Moore, of Ryan Leonard, but Will Smith really separated himself in most scouts' eyes as the best prospect out of the NTDP, and there was a reason he was picked up in the top 5. So, what I've really liked from Will Smith this year is just the intelligence, the awareness, and the play selection that he shows in this year. But in terms of what held him back in our rankings at Dobber Prospects and what made him more of a player in the caliber of an Oliver Moore or Ryan Leonard, just talk me through it, because we've had this debate all year with our scouts.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in the end, Smith did end up being our top-ranked NTDP player. Yeah. But I think what kept him maybe one step below where other scouts and where likely a lot of NHL teams had him for us was that we were a bit concerned with just how reliant he was on his superior intellect in the USHL context. He was really outthinking a lot of opponents and was relying on the extra space and time that he was able to make for himself. And that's what really enabled him to flash his skills when he had that space and time. And while I have no concerns with his problem-solving skills and being able to improvise, I am a little bit curious to see just how he adapts in terms of how he plans attacks at the NCAA level. I'm not quite sure he's going to translate to the NCAA just as smoothly as a guy like Logan Cooley did. However, I think that Will Smith is a fantastic prospect. But I think one more thing that held him back a little bit in our eyes is that we are not quite convinced that he's a center. And that is quite a big asterisk to have next to his name, because he was drafted to play down the middle, and San Jose will want him as a centerman going forward. However, because of his lackluster defensive game, he's not necessarily always engaged. He plays quite well around the perimeter and around the outside, but when he has to force his way to the inside, he can struggle a little bit against stronger competition. He's not all that physically mature, and he doesn't have the physical tools that other undersized players have. So while he's the same height as Ryan Leonard, he does not have Ryan Leonard's physical tools. And that will make it a little bit more difficult for him to play that inside-driven game. But he's certainly smart enough, and he has all the tools to compensate for it. I'm just curious to see exactly how he does it against college competition.
Yeah, and I think that'll be the main benchmark to see kind of what the progression will be for Will Smith, because creativity-wise, he doesn't have a comparable. I mean, he's up there with the most creative players I've seen The mitts on him are insane. I mean, he can wiggle and stick handle his way through opponents really easily at the USHL level. And on top of that, great playmaker and an underrated shot. I really like the release that he has, the velocity and power that he's able to put on a shot. I feel like that went under the radar, having played with Ryan Leonard and being kind of fortunate in a situation where he's feeding him most of the time. I'm interested to see what he does in more of a triggerman role, because I think they can fill that pretty well and become kind of a 30, 35, maybe even 40 goal guy at the next level, if he kind of develops that element of his game. But there's a lot of ways to go, which is why he wasn't kind of a clear-cut top 3 guy like it was on most rankings in the public and private sphere. But for me, he was the type of guy who was at the top of that next tier after kind of Leo Carlsson, Zach Benson. After that conversation, for me, Will Smith was right behind them in that next tier and kind of at the top of that tier. So I'm pretty satisfied with where he ended up on our Dopper Prospects rankings, but he might make us look foolish, a bit like Logan Cooley did on my rankings. Adam ranked sixth overall in his draft year. That's been looking pretty ridiculous after 1 year of college. So we never know. We'll see where that goes. But moving on from Will Smith, there's still a decent amount of prospects to mention for the Sharks, and that's why they're so high in our rankings, is that their prospect pool depth is really interesting. Now, they have William Eklund, who just graduated. He played 17 games over the course of 2 seasons, 9 games last year and 8 games this year. So he's out of the picture, but we still have Quentin Musty, who was picked up much later than he should have gone. For me, he was arguably in the same tier as Will Smith in terms of the quality of his upside. We're talking about a guy who's really raw, who does need to develop his game in certain areas. His decision-making is still inconsistent. But what was really interesting to me is that at the start of the year, after he had just come back from mono, I was having a lot of trouble seeing him kind of develop his hockey sense into a quality. For me, it was a clear weakness in his game. He had all the tools in the world, but not much of a toolkit to put it together and put it to use. But by the end of the year, my later viewings in March and April of Will Smith, of Quentin Musty, it became very clear that not only was his hockey sense not a weakness, it was probably his biggest strength, which was very interesting to see combined with his skill set, because he's a big guy. He can skate fairly well. His stride is a bit wonky, but the output is pretty good. He's got a fantastic shot. He's got fantastic hands. Some of the best playmaking elements in this draft. I mean, skill-wise alone, he's probably a top 5 prospect. It's just the question marks outside of that really kept him outside of that conversation, and why he ended up in the 20s. But for me, Quentin Musty, for me, just really screams high-quality, high-upside player who will need a lot of time. I'd be surprised if he's in the NHL by his 3rd or 4th year. But still, this is a prospect who could very well become a high-end first liner. Anything I didn't mention that you want to talk about for Musty?
He's really good. That's about it. I think you covered most bases there. Yeah,
absolutely. Outside of that, we've got a couple names. I'll let you talk me through them. Especially on D, there's some interesting options for San Jose.
For sure, but I'll leave one particular defenseman up to you. But I'll start off with one of my favorite players in this prospect pool, Daniil Gushchin. This is a guy that I have loved since the draft year. I thought he was awesome in Muskegon in the USHL in 2021 or 2020. I think it was 2020. But whichever year it was, he was awesome, and he went on to play excellently in the OHL. I got to watch him live a couple times, and he was always the best player on the ice. And he just continued that trend going into the AHL, and even got into 2 NHL games, and he's a point-a-game player in the NHL. So, Daniil Gushchin, my boy, I'm very proud of him. But this is a player who's extremely skilled. He's very, very intense. He plays with tremendous pace. He's a very, very good playmaker. He has a plus-level shot. He has all the tools to be a really effective middle 6 contributor, especially offensively. But he's also been really growing out his defensive game, and he's built himself quite a nice fallback game if the offense doesn't quite hit like I think it will. And he's one of my favorite players in this pool in terms of enjoyability of watching. Absolutely. But there's so many names in here. I mean, guys like Brandon Coe and Tristan Robbins are awesome. Same with Ethan Cardwell. Casper Haltonen was a great pickup. This is a player that really grew on me quite a bit as the season went on in his past season. And he has a great shot. He's a really intelligent goal scorer. At the U18s, he was the guy for Finland. He was everything Finland had.
It was a one-man team. It was absurd. And he's going to London.
Really good. And he's going to London in the OHL. I think the OHL is going to be really good for him in terms of developing, because He was a bit reliant on the extra space he had on the Finnish ice, especially in junior hockey, and learning to play especially playing like through contact around the slot. And I'm hoping to see him develop a better bumper goal scoring game when he has a lot like less space to work with. And I think this is a guy that could really be a middle six goal scorer and could maybe hit upwards of 20-25 goals.
Yep, absolutely. And on top of that, they've got some decent defensive depth. I mean, you're looking at a guy like Mattias Hävelid as a top end kind of number 2, number 3 upside guy. Really good offensively, great quality of kind of being able to move around the ice, find some space. Same for Luca Cagnoni, who's probably one of my favorite defensemen of last year's draft. A guy I had kind of as a lock in my top 20, who ended up in the hundreds.
Your boy. This is your boy.
100%. And I'm still kind of hitching my wagon on this guy and kind of riding it into the sunset. I really love the intelligence on him. For me, it was the smartest defenseman out of the 2023 NHL draft, and to see him available in the hundreds is just absolutely absurd. I think this is a fantastic pickup for the San Jose Sharks. They've got Shakir Mukhamadullin, who's been decent in the AHL, surprisingly, 10 points in 12 games. He's always been very chaotic to me. But we'll see where he goes, because a lot of his decision making is iffy, but he's got a lot of really interesting tools. So I'm curious to see how that develops. Absolutely. They've also picked up Henry Thrun for a draft pick, which is a pretty decent piece of work. So defensively, they got a decent amount of upside. Goalie wise, I mean, they are lacking for me so far, but we'll see where that goes. They still have a couple drafts to kind of round that out, but I think adding a really good a really good goaltending prospect would really catapult San Jose into the top 3 conversation. But that wraps things up for San Jose. Now we're going to be moving on to the Anaheim Ducks and their prospect pool. But before we get into that, I want to talk to you about our sponsor for this episode. It's Bird Dogs. Bird Dogs is a great online website in order to shop for some clothes. They're a very specific brand which have developed a lot of very interesting patents and technologies for their khakis specifically. They've sent us a pair of khakis which I've been wearing pretty regularly. They're extremely comfortable. They feel exactly like khakis, but they've got this stretchy fabric that really kind of molds your fit and doesn't really feel like you're wearing that kind of stiff cottony type of khaki that you would usually get with other brands. I mean, they do the exact same thing as a Lululemon, but they fit way better and they give you that sculpted look, which you really like. They've got this cloud knit fabric that they've developed themselves, which again looks exactly like khakis, but really feels different. It stretches so you get a way slimmer fit without having to sacrifice any movement at all. And they use anti-stink sweat wicking fabric, which keeps you cool and dry all day long. So go to birddogs.com/lockedonnhl or enter promo code LockedOnNHL for a free white tech hat with your order. Again, that's the hat that Sebastian has on his head right now if you're watching on YouTube. Again, that's birddogs.com/lockedonnhl or promo code LockedOnNHL for a free white tech hat. You will not want to take your Bird Dogs off. We promise you that. Alrighty, so moving on to the Anaheim Ducks. Now we're going to be talking about this prospect pool in depth, but for me, what really makes the Anaheim Ducks such a high prospect pool in both of our eyes is the defense depth. I mean, in terms of defensive prospect pools, there isn't a comparable in the NHL. I think they're on top in terms of the quality that they have in the system. I mean, you look at the prospect pool itself, you look at the depth in there. I mean, we're talking about guys like Pavel Mintyukov, who's probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite, non-NHL playing defenseman right now, just in terms of watching him. He's so fun. On top of that, you've got guys like Olen Zellweger, who just won CHL Defenseman of the Year for good reason. Let's start with those two, really. So who's your favorite between the two, and who do you think is going to have a better NHL career?
Oh, that's tough.
It's a tough one, eh?
You're making me make a tough decision here, especially because I was able to watch Mintyukov live in Ottawa quite a few times after he got traded at the deadline.
Yep.
And while he was kind of forced into a different style of play once he was traded, which made him less effective because when you try to control how Mintyukov plays, you are restricting him. Yeah. And he's at his best when he can just be free-flowing and play as he wants to. And I thought he was a lot better in Saginaw when he had that freedom. Mm-hmm. That said, I still think I'd go with Zellweger ahead, but it's really tight. So two very special defensemen. Mm-hmm. I think with Mintyukov, you get a tremendous combination of offensive creativity, dynamism, and defensive strength. He is very well-rounded, and can do just about anything that you want him to do. He can make some big hits if he needs to. He can clear the net front. He can go end to end and score. He's a great playmaker. He has a wicked shot.
He can forecheck.
He can forecheck. Genuinely, he can. I've seen it happen many times, and sometimes the Ottawa coach would then be a bit angry at the bench, but he did it well, so it's fun to watch, and he's very versatile, which is an incredible strength for him. Zellweger, however, I think I have to give him the edge. He has this fluidity and dynamism that I don't think any defensive prospect right now can match. Guys like Lane Hudson could if he were a better skater, but he's not, and Zellweger is an elite skater. David Jiricek could, but he's still a little bit wonky, and Zellweger isn't. And I'm not saying he's the best defensive prospect in the league, but he's definitely the smoothest. And I think that this is a player who will QB a first power play for years to come, and could likely be an impactful NHLer within a year's time. And he is just a tremendous prospect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, for me, I give the slight edge to Zellweger just based on with Zellweger, it's the toolkit. I mean, the tools are amazing, but it's just the way that he brings out every tool and blends them together seamlessly it's ridiculous. Watching him this year has been just an absolute treat, and watching him makes you love hockey, which is very hard. It's very rare that you get to say that about a player who's not in the NHL. I mean, watching him is just such an enjoyable thing. There's just fluidity and just an effortlessness to the way that he carries himself on the ice. That's insane. The hands on him are ridiculous. The playmaking smarts, the ability to see lanes that others don't, and even the shot has improved a lot. He's a pure offensive defenseman for me, but he's still able to hold his own in his defensive zone. He's not the type of guy who's going to clear the net front and be that physical presence, but at the same time, you want him to be playing in a specific role. If you pair him with a guy like Tristan Luneau, who they also have in the system, Tyson Hines, Noah Warren, those are the types of guys that you can pair to an Olen Zellweger, and they'll just bring out his skill set even further. But circling back to Mintyukov, I've always described him as a coach's nightmare and a GM's dream. That's how I've always described him. And in terms of just, he does things that coaches don't want their defensemen to do, but he'll win you games and cups and awards. Like, that's what he does. So I'm very interested to see how those two develop in the future. I think them being on the same pair would be just too chaotic for anyone. I don't think that, I think the NHL would implode. But then you circle to guys like I mentioned. I mean, Tyson Hines and Noah Warren are two very interesting defensive defensemen who are able to hold their own in their own zone, who are also able to defend the rush really well because they've got really good footwork. Tristan Luneau's in the same boat, but he's also got some decent offensive upside. He just won QMJHL Defenseman of the Year. So you got a trio of really good defensemen in there, and some of their depth options and depth pickups that they've got. I mean, they've got Jackson Lacombe, who played a couple NHL games and looked really good. They've also added Rodwin Dionicio, who's a long-term prospect, but one of the most creative and fun players you'll watch out of the OHL. So they've got some really decent pickups on D. They've also added some good goaltenders in Damian Clara, and they've got Lucas Dostal, who just graduated as well. So some decent option in between the pipes. And at forward, we've got
a guy like Leo Carlsson.
Yeah,
we could probably mention him, right? Like, I think he qualifies for our content here. Yeah, I mean, Leo Carlsson is awesome. This is a player that I think every scout fell in love with during the 2022-2023 season. And while I think we had him ranked a little bit lower than average because we had Matvei Michkov ahead of him at Dauber. This is a player who thrives in competitive professional environments, and that's not something that you say about many draft eligible players. Leo Carlsson grew a tremendous amount in his draft year season as well. Every opportunity he was given, he thrived in. This is a power forward playmaker who is one of the smartest players outside the NHL today, who, while the defensive game still has some warts, there's a very, very clear path for it to become a significant strength in 3 or 4 years' time. He can do pretty much everything. I think the goal scoring game is a clear area that needs a lot of work, but basically every other offensive tool is high end, whether it's the playmaking, the handling, the dynamism, the deception, the planning
moving,
of
goal
offenses.
scoring,
everything on puck and off puck. He's equally effective, and he can play a variety of roles. He can play either left wing or down the middle, though he should be developed as a center, and he will be in Anaheim. I'm positive. But yeah, Hadi, is there anything else about Leo Carlsson that I missed?
He's really good.
He's really good. Yeah, there we go. That's
absolutely, that's something up for him. But I do want to give a quick shout out to some of the other guys that they have in the pool at forward. I mean, they've got Nathan Gaucher, who we haven't even mentioned, who's probably going to be a very good middle six power forward winger. I think that he's developed his game in decent enough ways that I could see him become that middle six guy. I had a lot of doubts in his draft here, but he's proven me wrong so far from what I've seen. I don't think he'll be a center long term. I'd be quite surprised. On top of that, you've got Sasha Pastujov, who's only gotten better since getting drafted, just putting up ridiculous numbers in the OHL after transferring. He's been looking real good, and he signed as a LC, so I'm interested to see where that goes. And that's not even mentioning some of the guys they added this year. They've added Colson Petcher, who I'm a big fan of. Other guys like Yegor Sidorov. They have Sam Colangelo, who's still in the system, Jacob Perreault, who played a game last year, and I'm interested to see where he goes. So it's a lot of depth overall for the Anaheim Ducks in multiple positions. For me, the kind of lack of high-end potential at forward outside of Leo Carlsson kind of kept them outside of the top three, but they were fairly close for me, and it was a bit of a debate between them and the next team on our rankings. Speaking of which, we'll get right into them. We're going to be talking about the Buffalo Sabres, their prospect pool, why they very, very slightly outrank the Anaheim Ducks at 3 overall, coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects. Alrighty, so moving on to our final team of today's episode and our final segment, we're going to be talking about the Buffalo Sabres. Now, the Sabres have a very interesting prospect pool highlighted by one of my favorites from last year's draft. We've got Zach Benson as the top prospect in their pool. It's very tight, though, with the goaltender they have, and I think that's what separates them. But let's focus on Zach Benson for a second. For me and for you, he was a bit of a coin toss with Leo Carlsson at the draft, and this isn't a common kind of debate. A lot of people in their minds, Leo Carlsson is clear at the top. That's why he went second overall, but third overall rather. But
second.
Did he go second? He did go second for Anton Fantilli.
Yep.
That's still absurd to me. I love Anton Fantilli. But either way, for Zach Benson, kind of what puts him in that conversation with Leo Carlsson for you?
For me, it is the IQ. Zach Benson is genuinely a top 3 or 5 most intelligent non-NHL player today. And that is only going to get better in the next year or two before he hits the NHL. This is a player who dictates the entire play whenever he's on the ice. For the last 2 seasons, he's been playing for a dominant Winnipeg Ice team, now the Wenatchee Wild. And pretty much every single game I watched, it didn't matter whose line Zach Benson was on. His line was the best. Whether he was playing with Connor Geekie or Matthew Savoie or playing third line minutes, it didn't really matter. Whenever he was on the ice, it was as if the ice had completely tilted in the direction of Winnipeg. And this is a player who plays with tremendous intensity, is an elite level playmaker, genuinely, in my mind, the best playmaker in the 2023 NHL draft class, in contention with Connor Bedard and probably Leo Carlsson and Will Smith are the next couple. And I think it's quite tight in that top grouping. I don't think that Zach Benson is completely clear at the top, but I think he wins it out by a smidgen. And that is no insult to Connor Bedard's playmaking. I think it probably will surpass Zach Benson's, considering just how far it's come in the last year and a half. But as of right now, I do believe that Zach Benson is the best playmaker to come out of the 2023 NHL draft class. And you add in an elite level defensive game. In transition, he is perhaps not always the primary puck carrier because the skating is a weakness. However, it doesn't matter because of how intelligent he is. He's a master of the give and go. He constantly distributes the puck to his teammates, and just overall a highly impactful player who, in my mind, is going to be a very, 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 very good top 6 player with a high likelihood of first line upside.
Absolutely. And speaking of him being the best playmaker in the draft, I've said the same hopping on Joe DiBiase's morning show, his motoring radio show. Got a bit of raised eyebrows out of that, but I stick by it. I think that Zach Benson is going to become a high-end first-line elite playmaking, high-end defensive forward type of player at the NHL level. And I think that he nails a spot at center. Think Braden Point. I mean, same type of caliber, same type of quality, same type of tools if you look at him in a vacuum. So very, very interested to see what happens with Zach Benson in the future. But outside of Zach Benson, they've got a lot of quality. Now, what was the debate for me between them and Anaheim was the fact that all of the really interesting options that Buffalo has on D are all graduates. But outside of that, you look at some of their options and it's still fairly decent. I mean, I like Maxime Sherbak, who they added in last year's draft. He's one of the smartest kind of defenseman type of mold players that you could find from last year's drafts. Very intelligent, very composed with the puck. He does tend to default to simple plays, which did keep him outside of the top 2 rounds for me. But you look at his game, you look at the combination of intelligence and defensive tools, and you can very well see an NHL kind of bottom pair defensive defenseman, which is very realistic with him. And you add on top of that Mats Lindgren, who's still very raw, but I think could develop some really interesting tools to make him kind of that number 4, number 5 defenseman. You got a decent amount there. But what really separates them for me is the depth of goaltender quality and the depth of forward quality that they have in the pool. First and foremost, the only guy for me who kind of competes with Zach Benson at the top end of this pool is Devon Levi. And with Devon Levi, I mean, you look at what he's done so far at the NHL level, the things that he's done in the few games that he's played, and it just as a prospect, as a fan of prospects and as an analyst, it makes you salivate. I mean, he could very well be an elite goaltender at the next level. And I watch him and I see a lot of shades of UC Saros in terms of compensating for his lack of size perfectly, developing the adaptive tools in order to become exactly the type of goaltender you need to be when you're undersized like he is. I believe he's 6'1" or 6'2", which is in the tallest for goaltenders at the NHL level. Most of the quality goaltenders you see around 6'3", 6'4", 6'5", but the athleticism, the lateral movement, the mobility on Devon Levi, I don't think I can name you a goaltender prospect with better footwork. Maybe Dustin Wolf, but Levi's not quite. Devon Levi's still, for me, a decent step ahead of him. And that's why I compare him to Saros, is because of that quality. The fact that he's developed his game around his lack of size and made himself so effective as an undersized goaltender. It's going to be very, very interesting to watch in the future. But I want you to talk me through some of these forwards here that are at the top end. I mean, do we start with Noah Östlund or Matthew Savoie? And who's your favorite between those two and Jiri Kulich?
I mean, I think there are 5 forwards that we have yet to talk about that are really, really interesting. Mm-hmm. And you definitely named 3 of them right there. I think the player that I ranked lowest of the 3, it would now be my highest ranked one with Jiri Kulich. I think his progression as a D+1 was really impressive. And I liked Kulich a lot in his draft year. I liked him a lot before the U18s, which skyrocketed his stock and kind of, in my view, overcompensated at the time. But clearly I was wrong on that front. It was not overcompensation. And Jiri Kulich is looking like a really, really high-end potential middle 6 centerman with a ridiculous one-timer shot. This is a player who has significant first power play upside because of that shooting threat. And he's also a very high-end defensive player. And I think that if you look at guys like Noah Östlund, Matthew Savoie, who thrive in terms of just how intelligent they are, and they're very capable playmakers, and they really construct attacks. They are true offensive drivers in terms of they create opportunities. However, both players had a couple speed bumps in their D+1 seasons, especially Matthew Savoie. However, these are both guys that still have real top 6 upside. And while I think that Savoie especially likely projects better as a winger at this point in time than down the middle, Noah Östlund is still one of the smarter prospects that you can find in the NHL. And I thought that his D+1 season was probably showed the most progression out of his big line in his draft year with Lekerimäki and Ögren, who Ögren had played a very, very good season, and Lekerimäki had a great playoff run to finish off a disappointing season. But I thought Östlund was really steadily progressing throughout the year, which makes me a bit more hopeful in terms of that trajectory being more sustainable. But those are all really, really good prospects. And I'll also throw in Isak Rosen and Anton Wahlberg as guys with outside shots at top 6 upside and more likely third liners at the end of the day. But Isak Rosen played a really good a season last year, and was really getting into his groove, especially in terms of shooting off his weak foot and using his goal scoring as a real threat off the rush. And Wahlberg's a personal favorite of mine, but I'll leave him to you.
Oh yeah, Wahlberg's really fun. He's big, but he's got some really decent skills, some very surprisingly soft hands for his size. He can wriggle his way out of trouble pretty effortlessly. I do have some concerns with the projectability, the defensive game, but his tape has been all over the place, and there have been some games where he just looks superb in his own zone. So I'm very interested to see how he develops. I do also want to throw in Victor Neuchev, who we haven't mentioned, who was signed, and as well we've got Olivier Nadeau, who we haven't mentioned. Two very interesting prospects. I think Neuchev definitely has a bit more upside to his game and could develop into something really interesting. But we'll see where that goes. For us, I mean, the Buffalo Sabres are here for a reason at 3. They've got really good depth in multiple different positions. If they had a bit more depth on D in terms of the prospects that are in the pool versus the ones that are already graduated, they probably would be either first or second overall. But that wraps things up for today's episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They've got all your updates and news about what's going on in the sporting world. And make sure to tune in for our next episode where we are going to be filling out and completing our prospect pool breakdown with teams number 2 and 1. If you followed so far, it's pretty easy to tell which teams those two are going to be because they're the only two we haven't talked about. But if you haven't listened the whole way, just tune in. It'll be a fun time. Either way, we'll talk about them on the next episode of Locked On NHL Prospects. Thank you very much for watching.